Hello viewers, I'm SM Krishna. I have started manual code review videos on YouTube channel to help security engineers learn essential code review skills. Join me as we deep dive into code review techniques. The question that I asked you guys is identify vulnerabilities in below code. So we have three options that are correct: hard-coded database credentials, SQL injection, and CSRF. And the fourth option is SSRF was given, but there is no SSRF in this code. So these three vulnerabilities are confirmed vulnerabilities. I see hard-coded password 27, SQL injection 39, and 6 CSRF. But all three vulnerabilities are there. So let's analyze this code and see each vulnerability. Now, if you look at the code, the first one, hard-coded credentials or passwords, database credentials or database passwords are very clear because we are connecting MySQL underscore connect and then localhost root and bose123 as password. So bose123 dollar as password was kind of exposed here, and bankdb is also exposed in the code, so which is not a good thing. And then so the next part is CSRF vulnerability. We'll talk about SQL injection very detailed. So when it comes to the CSRF vulnerability, if you guys look at the CSRF vulnerability, this is a data write request. You can confirm it by looking at the update query. We're updating some data. Basically, feedback is what we are updating based on the username. So username, I'm getting it from the session. So logged in condition is satisfied, and username and sorry, based on the username, we are updating the feedback. So um, data write query. So it's probably vulnerability CSR vulnerability also. Right. So now let's focus on SQL injection. Right. So to understand this SQL injection, we need to look at the data flow diagram. Okay. So to create the data flow diagram to make it easy for you guys, what I did is I created three-tier architecture, and here there is something called feedback FB. You can see that, right? So this is the server-side code which is written in PHP. So when user submits some feedback, let's say if user submits test into the feedback and he sends his feedback from browser to the application server receives it. So you can see that, in the post request, user sent FB value and it is stored in dollar feedback, right? And we have already session ready. So that which means we are logged in, as I said earlier. So we are retrieving the username from the session and then storing it into $user. So here, untrusted source is basically feedback. We can consider username as also untrusted source. We'll talk about it later if required. So we got username from the session and feedback from the user. Okay, so user supplied this feedback, and then what we did is, we created a query called, we call it as dynamic query. Update bank table set feedback as dollar feedback, where username is equals to dollar username, and then we executed this query, or we sent this query to the database to get it executed. Okay, so once the query got executed, we'll get the response saying that the update was successful, and then we convey that back to the feedback to the user saying that feedback updated. Okay, so that's the data flow that we are dealing with. Now let us see what happens with the with the different kinds of queries. Okay, so here the query that we used, update bank data bill set feedback dollar feedback, where username is equals to dollar username, right? So here if you look at this query is called dynamic query. What do we call this query? We call this query as dynamic query. So why we call it as dynamic query? Because dynamically user supplies the data that will be placed in the data fields, and query will be created and then sent to the database. Okay, the query gets created in the application layer, and then we send that query to the database. Okay, so for example, update bank table set feedback is equals to test. So if I give test as feedback, it goes to the server, and it grabs this username from the session and then updates a test into the database. Okay, so for example, to prove that this is vulnerable to SQL injection, in case instead of placing test in the feedback page here, in the feedback, instead of placing test in the feedback page, if I place test single quotation where username is equals to murali hash minus minus. Okay, so what I did, instead of giving test, what I did, test single quotation where username is equals to murali hash minus minus, right? And then we have the remaining query, but the remaining query will get commented out because hash minus minus will comment out anything that comes later, right? So instead of updating the feedback of the original logged in user Krishna, we're actually updating the feedback of another user called Morley, right? The same thing applies for password feature. So basically update so because of these dynamic queries, we may get into SQL injections. Okay, so to avoid SQL injection, what we need to do, we need to avoid the confusion between data and query. So if you guys observe, update bank table set feedback is a part of query, where username is a part of query. Here Krishna and test are the data. Okay, so here test and Krishna is the data. So we are actually giving data dynamically. So what we need to do is we need to separate the data and query part and then give it to the database, right? If you look at the parameterized query, mysql underscore prepare, so we are preparing a query. So what it does is update bank table set feedback is equals to question mark. I'm not giving the original feedback where username is equals to question mark. So I created this statement and sent that statement to the connection. Okay, which means my database received this query, but database do not know how to execute it or completely execute it. But database is prepared that okay, I received the query, now I need to wait for this question marks is the data that is going to be supplied. I need to wait for the data, and then it's waiting for the data to be supplied. So we are binding those data parameters of dollar feedback and dollar username and sending that separately in the statement bind statement. So now we'll execute this statement. So when we execute this statement, we supply data separately and then queries separately and the data separately, which will, make more clear picture to the database. So even if you inject a query in the feedback, it won't be considered as a query. It will just simply get stored in the database. Okay, so how can you identify parameterized queries? You will have question marks instead of parameters or variables which will supply the data, and they'll get binded to the those parameters with the help of bind statement. That's what parameterized queries does. And there is another way to do the same thing. I mean, this to achieve the same thing, which is called stored procedures. Okay, the name itself says stored procedure. Procedure is nothing but function. So whatever our procedure is there, whatever our function that is need to be there, that we will, define in the database itself. Okay, so what we are going to do, we are going to create a procedure in the database. So inside the database, we'll go to the database terminal and then we'll run a query. So like this, create a procedure, update feedback. Now we are creating a function or procedure which is called update feedback in the database, and it is expecting two inputs. One is feedback as input, which is a text file. Another input is username, and then it's a varchar. Okay, it's expecting two inputs from the user, and then what it needs to do, it needs to update the bank table with this and the query, basically our regular query. But we declared these two as data that is coming, and this is our query. Now database already know that which part is data, feedback and username, which part is code. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to simply call that query, call update bank feedback. So I'm directly from the PHP perspective, I'm calling update feedback, dollar feedback and dollar username. Okay, I'm passing these values to this procedure, so that we just need to give that information or data, it will automatically execute that query without any confusion. So if you implement parameterized queries or stored procedures properly, if you implement it in safe way, then you don't have SQL injection in the application. If you implement dynamic queries like this, then you're going to have SQL injection in your application, right? So there's a very important question that comes a lot of times from the interviews. What is the difference between parameterized query versus stored procedure? Right, there's a query that you see a lot of times from the interviews. So if you look at that SQL query, with parameters, you can see a question marks and question mark, and it's a part of PHP code. We wrote it as a part of PHP code. In case of stored procedure, it is divided into SQL part of the code, PHP part of the code. In SQL part of the code, you will create a procedure. Procedure is nothing but function, and you will call that function from the PHP code. Okay, so that's the reason why SQL query with parameters is called parameterized query, and created dynamically in the application code. Of course, we create it dynamically in the application code, but it's not a dynamic query. Don't get confused that it is a dynamic query. Helps to prevent SQL injection if implemented properly. Can be used with simple and complex SQL statements. Okay, and stored procedure is a pre-compiled SQL statement stored in the database, can contain logic and control flow. So these procedures can have, it's like a function or a method that is belongs to SQL. Improve performance by reducing the data transfer and recompilation. The performance advantage is also added advantage in addition to preventing SQL injection. So both parameterized queries and stored procedures can prevent SQL injection. So I'll add this point to stored procedure also. Hope that makes sense. You can answer your interviews. Thank you very much for patiently listening.